You are John Kennedy, and you have just received from information that is shocking. Indeed, it's alarming. The Soviet Union is installing nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. So, Mr. President, John Kennedy, what are you going to do about it? A little bit of background. Cuba was a long-time protege, protectorate of the United States from the early 20th century until the late 1950s. Fidel Castro led an anti-American revolution, an implicitly anti-American revolution against the authoritarian government of Cuba and gained power in 1959. Castro did what any nationalist would have done under the circumstances. Instead of keeping Cuba dependent on the United States, he looked for help elsewhere, and the obvious elsewhere in the middle of the Cold War was the Soviet Union. The United States, from the beginning of the Cold War, had been very worried about Soviet influence in the Western Hemisphere. American leaders referred back to the Monroe Doctrine of the 1820s that said essentially that Europe ought to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere is America's backyard. America will take care of things in the Western Hemisphere. And for a long time, this was just a statement of kind of general preference. But during the Cold War, it takes a particular bite because the Soviet Union, if it has naval bases, if it has military bases in the Western Hemisphere, can cause trouble for the United States. In particular, can threaten American access to the Panama Canal. This is why the United States is so sensitive to what's going on in Cuba and other countries of the Caribbean basin. So, Castro takes power in Cuba, turns to the Soviet Union, and the Soviets are quite happy to form an alliance with this guy who now declares himself a communist. And so it looks as though the containment policy announced by Harry Truman at this point, almost a decade and a half earlier, is failing in that one part of the world where American leaders and Americans generally want it to succeed. That is, keep communism, Soviet power, out of the Western Hemisphere, right next to the United States. So, Mr. Kennedy, you are worried about Castro. One of the first things you do upon becoming president is to authorize a CIA operation to try to overthrow Castro. This operation, not coincidentally, had been planned during the Eisenhower administration, and Eisenhower had been a big fan of covert operations. And Eisenhower's covert operations had toppled governments in unfriendly governments, pro-communist governments in Iran and Guatemala, and now, why not, in Cuba? But Eisenhower didn't have time to put the operation into effect, and so he leaves office, you take office in January 1961, and the plan there is on the table. And the CIA is saying, it's going to work, let's give it a go. You, John Kennedy, are pretty new, untested in foreign affairs. And so you say, okay, well, if this is what the experts say, I guess this is what we're going to do. You give the go-ahead. And the operation, an invasion that takes place at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, is a tremendous failure. So Castro gets wind of what's happening. He's waiting there with his soldiers, and they capture, kill, imprison all of the people, all the pro-American forces who are engaged in the operation. It's a huge embarrassment for you, Kennedy. It looks like you don't know what you're doing in foreign policy. And Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, takes this as a cue to think, okay, this guy really doesn't know what he's doing. So apparently, as a result of this, Khrushchev gets together with Castro and says, I got a great idea, Fidel. Here's what let's do. How about I, leader of the Soviet Union, install nuclear missiles in your country, Cuba. And this way, it will afford you protection against an American invasion, future American tampering, because they're not going to dare invade your country if your country has nuclear missiles. Now, you don't get to control the missiles. I'm going to control the missiles, but nonetheless, I'm your ally. I will take care of you. So, this is the plan that is proposed to Castro, and Castro says, all right, let's do it. So, Khrushchev decides the missiles are going to go into Cuba, but he wants to do it secretly, because he knows if the United States learns about this, then the Americans are going to try to stop it. And who knows, they might very well invade Cuba at that point to overthrow Castro and prevent the missiles from going in. So you do this in as much secrecy as you can. And you send Soviet advisors and engineers and the like, but Cuba is your ally, so this is not any particular red flag. But there are a lot of people in Cuba who don't like Castro, and they have friends, Cuban friends, who move to Florida, and word gets out that something is going on in Cuba, something kind of mysterious, because Cubans are being kept away from these new installations. Word makes it to the US CIA, the American Spy Agency, and the CIA confirms, finally, with aerial surveillance photographs, that what's going in Cuba are these missile emplacements. And the CIA brings the information to President Kennedy. And you, President Kennedy, you've got to decide, what are you going to do about this? This is you. You are John Kennedy. You know that there are these Soviet missiles going into Cuba. What do you do? Well, the first thing that you do is to convene your top advisors. You put together something called the Executive Committee, or XCOM. And it consists of your top military advisors, your top intelligence advisors, your top diplomatic advisors, your political advisors, everybody you think who has some good ideas on this subject. And they give you a set of alternatives. And alternative one is to do nothing. And it's presented this way. Look, Mr. President, the United States has nuclear missiles in Turkey, right next to the Soviet Union. And the United States has claimed its right to have those missiles in Turkey. Now, in fact, those are kind of older missiles. We're going to pull them out, maybe replace them, maybe not. But we can hardly complain about Soviet missiles in Cuba without them saying, well, you've got your missiles in Turkey. And they might propose a trade, and we don't want to do that. Even though we're probably going to take the missiles out anyway, still. We need the bases in Cuba, in Turkey, we need the support of Turkey for intelligence flights and all this other stuff. So we don't want to be told what to do about our allies. Therefore, we can hardly tell the Soviet Union what to do about their allies. Something else. The Soviet Union already has nuclear missiles in the Soviet Union. And a nuke is a nuke. You know, if you get killed by a nuke from Cuba, that's no different than getting killed by a nuke from Siberia. So it's really not that big a deal. We'll just, roll with it. This is the new world that we're going to have to live with. Okay, so option one is to do nothing. This doesn't look so good. Kennedy's a little bit concerned about this for a couple of reasons. One is that missiles aren't exactly missiles. The missiles launched from the Soviet Union take about half an hour to get to the United States, and American distance warning devices can pick them up, and the president will have maybe 20 minutes to decide what to do. Missiles launched from Cuba, however, could hit Washington within 6, 8, 10 minutes. And so the president's not going to have any time to react at all, and that's a big deal. So if you're trying to decide what to do about some incoming missiles, it's nice to have a little bit more time. So the missiles in Cuba really do change things from a strategic standpoint. The missiles in Cuba also change things from a political and diplomatic standpoint, because this is, all of a sudden, these missiles are right next to the United States. Americans might go crazy as a result of this, and you can bet, Mr. President, you're a Democrat, the Republicans, they're going to beat you over the head with this one, because you lost Cuba, and now Cuba is this nuclear dagger pointed at the heart of the United States. So you're going to have to weather that if you do nothing. Okay, so Kennedy is inclined not to do nothing, so what are you going to do? Well, what are your other options, Mr. President? Well, one possibility is to make a speech, to say, okay, Chairman Khrushchev, you got to get those missiles out of Cuba. The United States is not going to stand for this as a new status quo, and so I insist that you get those missiles out of Cuba. Now, of course, a speech has to be backed up by something, and so what's it going to be? Oh, what if Khrushchev says no? Well, so that allows you to escalate. Oh, by the way, the speech could be accompanied by, let's say, a blockade of Cuba, because we, the CIA, We're not sure if the missiles are operational yet. Well, they're not actually they're not operational yet, but we don't know if they have all the parts in Cuba to make them operational. It's quite likely they need more stuff coming in from the Soviet Union. So if we blockade Cuba, they can't get that more stuff. But we have to be honest, Mr. President, we don't really know where we are on this subject. So this is one of those unknowns you're going to have to deal with. So option 2 is a speech and maybe combined with a blockade. Oh, but if you do go with the blockade, probably don't call it a blockade, because a blockade is technically, in legal terms, an act of war. Call it something else. Come up with another name for it, because we really don't want to go to war with Cuba, because Cuba is backed by the Soviet Union, and so we got this war going on in Vietnam, and so we don't need another war. Okay, so that's option 2. Option 3, the military's now weighing in. We need to take those missiles out because we don't want to have to deal with operational nuclear missiles in Cuba. So we can take them out with an airstrike, and we'll just bomb the missile sites, and boom, then they won't be operational. And it'll send a message to the Soviets, you can't do this kind of thing. It'll be clean, no Americans are going to have to get killed, no boots on the ground, and just boom, poof. But you, Mr. President, you're a little bit of a skeptic. Actually, I should say you're really a skeptic of these sorts of things after the lousy advice you got regarding the Bay of Pigs. So you say to the generals, what guarantee do you give me that you can actually take out the missiles? You can bomb the sites, but how do we know that they're not going to be in underground bunkers? Can you guarantee that if I give you the order to bomb, that the missiles will not be able to be launched? Well, the generals have to say, well, no, we can't. But, we think you can give a relatively high probability. No guarantees. There are no guarantees in war. No guarantees in life. Okay, so option 4. Option 4 is an invasion. Look, Mr. President, some of the generals are all in favor of an invasion because we can really get the job done. Now, just let us go in. We can take out the missile sites. We know where they are. We can occupy the missile sites. We can destroy the missiles. Maybe we can actually grab some of the technology and see what the Soviets have these days. In the meantime, while we're there, we might as well overthrow Castro and put in a government that's friendly to us, and then problem solved. So, these are your options, Mr. President. What do you do? Well, you think about it. You say, well, okay, in the first place, I don't want an invasion of Cuba. I'm ruling out the one at the upper end, at least at first. I'm ruling out the airstrikes as well, because this is the way World War II started for the United States. Japan launched a sneak attack on the United States, and Americans, quite understandably, condemned Japan for that kind of stuff. Well, we would be the Japan in this situation, because the United States is not at war with Cuba, and to bomb Cuba, to invade Cuba, this is something we just don't do. We don't want to do this. The United States doesn't get in that business. It's unethical. In addition, it's bad for America's reputation. We've got this reputation as being the leader of the free world, and we don't just willy-nilly invade our neighbors because we don't like their governments, and we don't like them doing what we're doing in other countries. So there's a certain amount of good example the United States needs to set in the world. On the other hand, or maybe this is the third hand, I can't do nothing. I can't do nothing. It's going to send a signal to the world that the United States can be pushed around by the Soviet Union, and that I can be pushed around by Nikita Khrushchev. So that's not going to let that happen. So I'm going to go with the speech and the blockade. But the blockade, we'll call it a quarantine. And the speech is going to be, it's going to be a tough speech. So this is what you do. You give a speech, and you say on national TV, which is watched all over the world, in fact, that the missiles have to go. And Nikita Khrushchev, you got to pull those missiles out. The peace of the world is in danger. And furthermore, if those missiles become operational, and if those missiles should be used against the United States, then the United States will consider a launch of missiles from Cuba to be a launch of missiles from the Soviet Union itself. And it will be met with a full retaliatory response. Now, this is huge. This is the first time, this is the only time the President of the United States has ever gone public with an ultimatum, a threat like this, a direct threat of nuclear war against the leader of the Soviet Union. So this is huge. And at the same time, you announce that there is going to be this blockade, except you call it a quarantine. Quarantine seems to be a nice public health sort of thing rather than an active war. So this is what you say. And now the world waits. The world waits to see how Khrushchev is going to respond. And Khrushchev takes some days to respond to this. There's some back channel negotiation. He writes you a letter, then he writes you another letter. And the world is watching as Soviet ships approach the quarantine line. Will they challenge America's blockade? And Khrushchev decides they won't. And so Khrushchev agrees to pull out the Soviet missiles. And he says, okay, here's the deal. I'll pull the Soviet missiles out of Cuba, but I need a public promise from you, Mr. President, that the United States will not invade Cuba. Because the point of our missiles, this is what you, Khrushchev, are saying for public consumption, the point of the missiles is to safeguard Cuba. And if we get a promise from the United States that there's going to be no invasion, then the missiles aren't necessary. And this is where we're going to go. Now, what Khrushchev doesn't say, what Kennedy doesn't say in public, is that there's another part of this deal that is kept very quiet. And it was quiet for years. And that is, behind the scenes, Kennedy tells Khrushchev that the United States will take those missiles out of Turkey. And it may be that part of Khrushchev's design from the beginning was to get those missiles out of Turkey. And so it turns out to be sort of a fair is fair arrangement where no Soviet missiles in Cuba right next to the United States, no US missiles in Turkey right next to the Soviet Union. So that's the way things turn out. But there's one other aspect about this that is, well, not so good. Kennedy comes out of this looking like this macho guy who has stood up to the Soviet Union, basically stared down the Soviet Union. Khrushchev comes out of this looking publicly rather weak because he gave in to Kennedy's ultimatum. In fact, Khrushchev is overthrown. He's deposed, toppled from power within a year and a half of this. But there's another element that is of longer standing development and more important development, and that is a fundamental reason that Khrushchev gave in to the American ultimatum, Kennedy's ultimatum, was that at that point in the nuclear arms race, the Soviets were outgunned. The Soviet weapons were outnumbered by American weapons, perhaps as much as 8 or 10 to 1. So if push had come to shove, and if the missiles had started flying, the Soviet Union would have been obliterated in this nuclear war, and the United States simply badly damaged. Now, simply badly damaged in a nuclear war is a big deal, but it would clearly be a U.S. victory. The Soviet Union didn't have the nuclear arsenal to really threaten the United States the way the United States could threaten the Soviet Union. And the Soviet leadership came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, as it was called, determined that this wasn't going to happen again. So over the course of the next 10 years, there was a big buildup of the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal. So by the 1970s, the Soviet Union had a nuclear arsenal as big as that of the United States. So John Kennedy, unfortunately, tragically, was dead by this time, assassinated in 1963. But if he could have foreseen this, well, maybe his actions in the Cuban Missile Crisis would have been different. Maybe not.